All right, welcome to Building the Athlete. I'm your host, Scott Benson. Today with me is Kim Fauskee with Athlete XQ. Kim, welcome to the show. Before I let you introduce yourself, I'm just going to throw a question at you real quick. Do
Sure.
you feel like sports, particularly with youth athletes, is one of the greatest ways for young athletes, young people to learn a lot of lessons about what happens after sports is done?
Boy, a loaded question, but a hundred percent yes. As somebody that was a former athlete that actually has children that have played sports and a son that plays college football, I certainly think that they've become better in more well-adjusted young adults by having this sports background. It certainly has provided a number of things in terms of structure, education, resilience, self-confidence, things that sometimes you have to learn later on in life, that youth sports definitely teaches you. So 100%, I think it is a great foundation to prepare you for later on in life.
Okay. All right, good answer. That means we can continue. So, Kim, go ahead and introduce yourself and give us some background and kind of, as an athlete, and then how you got to where you're at today doing what you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and make this a novella and not a novel in this. It's fairly uncommon how I got to where I am today. I was an athlete, basketball player that grew up and played through, the youth sports, through high school, played in college as well, and didn't attain the professional ranks or anything after college. Ended up going to business school, became a C-suite executive in a publicly traded company for about a little over a decade. Came out of doing that, went into consulting, into private equity, and in some other businesses, and continued a kind of robust personal consulting practice in business for a number of years, which I've kind of, even through COVID and now I've kind of shed a bit to down to just a couple of clients. How I fell into this athlete XQ in working with athletes in transition away from sport was just by pure happenstance. It really started in conversations that I was having with friends of my oldest daughter who had played college football at a Power Five school, had moved on to the NFL, and just through social interactions with them, started having conversations. And through one of these conversations, one of the athletes says, "You know more than my agent. I want you to be my agent." And did not ever want to become a sports agent. Nothing against sports agents. I mean, they certainly have their purpose, and there's a lot of good ones out there, and there's a few that aren't so good. But that was never my purpose that I wanted to kind of serve there. So it kind of gave me a little bit of an epiphany in terms of kind of what was happening with these athletes, especially these young athletes and kind of their first, second years of their professional careers, that they were kind of kept in the dark. They obviously that they were out there to perform a function as a professional athlete, but they really knew nothing else. They weren't taught anything at the university level or beforehand. It was my whole life was an athlete. So I started having more and more conversations with other athletes in different sports. And I happened to live in Southern California and have a couple of friends that were prior Olympic athletes and had this conversation with them as well. And they all said that the hardest part of sport was leaving the sport, not playing the sport, but actually leaving the sport and finding out what was next. And so I thought to myself, with my business background and consulting background and being an athlete, was there something I could do to potentially help these athletes in transition make for a more seamless and sustainable transition outside of sport? So, I started thinking about what I could do for them. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a career counselor, I'm not any of this stuff, but through my life experience, how I saw my work in the corporate area, the consulting area, and things like that, and what I had learned in my experiences, could I help them navigate through some of these waters so they could have another successful career? So purely by happenstance, and I worked by referral, and so I started working and having some success and clients were having success and doing this transition. And so I kind of have this small funnel of clients that keep coming to me.
Okay. So I mean, just you saw a need, and like many small businesses, you spun it and turned it into something.
Yeah, I certainly don't label myself as an entrepreneur, but yeah, it's kind of the entrepreneur's, thing is you see a need out there and you fill it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, kind of what you're discussing with, your athletes' identities and or lack thereof is really was the premise for why I started my business. And I mean, kind of indirectly doing somewhat the same thing.
Mhm.
I was a Division I athlete, a high level Division I athlete. When I was young, I was going to the Olympics. I was without a doubt, that's what I was doing. And, that story doesn't end up, with a happy ending most of the time for most athletes. Much like myself, it didn't work out the way I expected it to. Fast forward, I get out of college. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to school because I was going to be an Olympian.
I'm
Um,
probably a little bit older than you, but when school and athletics were kind of paired together, I said, "Really, that you have to go to class to be
yeah,
able to play?" Yeah.
Yeah. So I got out of college, find myself back home. I was a track and field athlete, so the road to being a professional athlete is not real clear, especially 30 years ago. So the next thing I know, I'm working at a gym handing out towels at the front desk. And I can't tell you the amount of shame that I was dealing with. I mean, just emotionally, it just destroyed me that, how did I go from where I was months ago to this is going to be my life now? And so I kind of went a little bit different route, a lot the same as you. The one thing that I could understand and that made sense to me was I got into the sales world because
Mhm.
as an athlete, that felt like a competition to me. And if I would just fight for deals to me, it was just trying to win, then I figured the money would come as long as I was winning the deals. And so, went that route, ended up buying a business when I was in my 20s and have really owned several different businesses throughout my life. But when I turned, I think I was right around 40, I started to realize how impactful my athletic career had been on my success. And that's when I made the decision. I was working in finance and banking at the time, and I left that career, and I had to have a serious talk with my wife that I think I can make a go of this sports performance thing, and started in my basement. And, 16 years later, we have over 600 clients that we're working with. But my goal was to teach these kids how important the lessons of sports, carry over to you
Mhm.
being a successful athlete. And I've been doing it long enough now to where kids that 15 years ago were calling me about sports are now calling me for advice on when should I have children,
Right.
should i
Exactly.
should i propose to my girlfriend, should we buy a house, and still coaching just different conversations with
Mhm.
my older athletes. So I really respect what you're doing. The one thing I will say is I was really, really lost when I graduated from college, and I really wish there would have been some resources in place, like what you're doing. Do a lot of colleges now offer services like that, or is it more independent people like you?
Yeah, so I never want to disparage anybody because I think if there's some level of help or some program out there that is at least offering help, I think that's a good thing, right? The university level, not really that I'm aware of because I've been asked to come give some talks to certain teams at the university level. I think it's so convoluted now with the transfer portal and NIL that is the importance of it, and that the universities, and this is my opinion, are not invested anymore in a 4-year athlete. They're invested in a 1-year athlete now. It's interesting and maybe divulging away from the topic for a second here, but I got invited to Australia a couple years ago to talk with and work with the National Rugby League down there, which would be the parallel to the National Football League here in the United States. And the Australian Football League, the AFL down there, similar, called footy in Australia down there. And they were interested in my take on athlete transition. They put a ton of effort into their programs into athlete transition. They don't have a feeder system like the United States does from the university to professional ranks or to USA track and field from the university or whichever. They come up through club programs. And if you're good enough in a club program, you get moved into, shared housing and play the sport. But a lot of what they spend time doing down there with their youth athletes in their club programs is really teaching them how to be resourceful and sustainable adults. And it goes all the way through to when they reach the professional ranks is that they carve out one afternoon. So you go into the International Rugby League facility and the team that I was with was the Penrith Panthers there. So as an athlete, you walk in there, and the first thing you do when you get into the facility, and the facilities are beautiful. They're like the NFL facilities here in the United States, all the high tech, everything there. You check in with your wellness advisor. The first thing you do when you walk in, you don't walk into the locker room and slap hands with your teammates or whatever. The first thing you do is you have to have a check-in with your wellness advisor there to see how things are, mentally you're doing, physically you're doing, and all that stuff before you go on to, the pre workout meal and do your workout and stuff. So that happens every time. They also carve out by contract with the league one afternoon a week where the athletes are either working on academic process if they're going to university down there or some level of trade if they're wanting to become plumbers, electricians, or entrepreneurs or whatever. There's one afternoon per week that's carved out per their collective bargaining agreement that they have to do that. And a lot of them are in internships, et cetera, down there. So they place a lot of emphasis on your identity outside of sport and what you're going to do when rugby ends for you there, that you can go right into your next profession down there. So it's very, very interesting because when I was doing more research here in the United States about this, I had some access to, I won't name names, but access to team owners. And I asked them, I said, no right or wrong answer here, no judgment here. Do you feel that you have an obligation as a team owner to how well your athlete that has performed and worked for you transitions into the next phase of their life? And they both said that they didn't, not that they didn't care about it, they didn't feel it was their responsibility. In the United States, you're getting paid, millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars for some people. They felt that was on them. They felt they put a little bit back off on the unions, the players associations and things like that. And it's the same thing when I dealt with the United States Olympic Committee in terms of transition. They offer a very kind of cookie cutter transition program down there for athletes, which pretty much if I spent 3 hours on the internet one day, I could, pretty much get the same thing out of it. And they just didn't feel like that they needed to provide anything more for them. So to answer your question, I'm sorry, that was a long-winded that I never got to the base of your question there. So the answer is no. So the answer from the university level is really no. The answer from the professional ranks is kinda. I think it's more image to base that we have to have this. And I know people within the players associations, and I think there's it's not smoke and mirrors. They're really actually trying to help, but it's just a cookie cutter methodology that they're applying to everybody.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't work.
No. And, you've said it and I've said it already probably a couple times if we've both used the word identity.
Yeah, so that is the number one piece, right? So if there's commonality, if I take somebody from the National Rugby League in Australia to an NFL player to an NBA player to an Olympic swimmer, there's one commonality in the dozens and dozens of athletes that I've worked with or had discussions with. One commonality: I will never be as good as at anything in life as I was in sport. Their whole identity is wrapped around the sport and their accomplishments in sport. They either feel that that's going to carry them the rest of their life, or they had reached that pinnacle in sport, so it should be easy to reach the next pinnacle in life.
which you and I both know that that doesn't necessarily turn into a seamless transition. Let's break down identity, I guess. Just talk, I guess, a little bit about when you think it gets lost, and when you see an athlete that comes to you that's very well adjusted and has an identity outside of their sport, why is that? What do you usually see with that?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head early in our discussion when you were talking about your university experience and track and field and what that was going to be after you had finished your 4 years there. I think the identity starts getting wrapped up with somebody that's been told, whether you're 8 years old or 16 years old, you're told you're really good at what you do there, and that you're better than everybody else. And I think, people, you start building that level of self-confidence, go, wow, I am better than everybody else because the accolades come, the news stories come, the awards come, everybody's paying attention to you. So now your identity has already started to be wrapped around, I am this above average or elite athlete. Right. And so that carries you, hopefully that carries you through. And as you well know, I mean, you have to have a fairly high level of self-confidence to be successful in high level of sport. Right. And so that carries you through however far you go in sport. And so, you know this from being an athlete. I mean, your schedule's told to you, your workout program's told to you, your nutrition's told to you, your lifting schedules told to you, everything is provided in this kind of athlete foundation, right? You have these boundaries as an athlete, especially, I don't know if it was for you, if you lived in a dorm or an area with other track and field athletes. Most universities, you all live together in
Mhm.
things. You're all taking class, and especially now, you're all taking class together, you're associating, you're practicing, and now everything's a year-round sport. So you're together all the time. And so you walk in, like I said before, you walk into the facility, you know what you're going to eat. They already tell you what the practice attire is, they tell you what the game attire is, and then one day you're on the outside looking in, and you're like, I don't even know who I am anymore. Because those barriers, those boundaries, that foundation has now gone away. And I think you had asked me a question earlier before we started recording about why I prefer to work with athletes after they've retired or athletes while they're still playing. And obviously I like to do it when they're still playing and trying to be proactive because I think that identity piece is huge to start building and evolving what that looks like outside of sport. You asked me, the second part of the question was where I saw it be successful, and where I saw it was successful with an identity outside of sport pretty quickly was with those that had a good family foundation, where the parents actually kind of concentrated on that, okay, you're this great athlete and we're going to support you 100% to take it as far as you can. But they also understood that that was going to end fairly early in your life, and that there was going to be a huge another part of your life that you had to start thinking about there. So I think that family foundation is probably the commonality that I see out there, or guys and gals that kind of bought in, and I don't want to say it was self-help, but actualization type stuff, and really started, maybe working with a sports psychologist or a mindset person, and kind of really figuring out what makes them tick. So they're much easier to form that identity outside of sport, if that answers your question.
Yeah, 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 and it's interesting because eh, I have an athlete that he runs at the University of Oregon now. He's one of the top distance runners in college. He was in high school as well, one of the best in the country. And, when I started working with him, very difficult to communicate, not a lot of words said back and forth. And one day I just asked him, what do you like to do other than run? And you would have thought I cracked the code. He started telling me about how he's second chair saxophone in the band. He loves to play frisbee golf. And, he opened up about these things more than he did because you can tell the only thing anybody's ever asked him about is his running and his
Mhm.
competing and his winning. And he was like a little kid telling me about all these things. And, it's just kind of to your point. Like you start to win, you start to get recognized. And all of a sudden, that's all anybody wants to talk to you about. Or the people that's your support staff around you, they're there to make you win more, not to make you into a better human being.
Right.
And so I think there's thousands and thousands and thousands of athletes out there that are dealing with these issues that they don't really understand where they're going, or at that age it's so hard to even think about. The majority of your life is after sports is done, and it's such a
Yeah, that's funny you bring that up because that's the analogy that I use because I remember being a 21-year-old at one point, and 30 seemed so far in the distance,
right.
I couldn't even see it,
Yeah.
right? So or even 25 was like, "Oh, yeah, that's way down the road. I'll deal with that when I get there," right? And then 30, it's like, "Well, geez, yeah, I can't even see that. So I can't even tell you what's gonna happen when I'm 30." Right. And then all of the sudden you blink and you're like 25 and you blink twice and you're 30. And it's like, you don't want to be on that merry-go-round of futility.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I have a little bit of an internal think tank because I have a family member that's in his second year of playing in the NBA right now. And I actually posed this question to him about, okay, you're a basketball player, very good basketball player, drafted into the NBA, making good money as a rookie, making good money as a second year player now. But I said, I hate to be morose here, but if you're down on the free throw line holding your knee, what's next? And I think it goes to your point, right? That young people don't really, and I was that young person. I didn't really think about what was next, at that point. But I think it's a good question. I think we as kind of mentors and elders that have kind of been through it need to ask the question of our young athletes about what is next because hopefully you get to play 10 or 15 years and pocket a whole bunch of money and then you got a ton of options to do, but that's really not the case with everybody out there. So you got to start thinking about that at some point. What kind of what you like, what your passions are, what you may want to do next, and start thinking about that.
Yeah. You had made the comment, to be a high level athlete, that you have to have a certain amount of self confidence to be able
Mhm.
to perform at that level, which I agree with. I asked this question at Dr. Nathan Zinser on, probably a month or two ago. He's an author and a sports psychologist. And I asked him the question, and I want to use this question to kind of lead into your model, your business model that you talk about. But is self-confidence and emotional intelligence the same thing?
Yeah, I don't think they're the same thing. I think they kind of go part and parcel with each other a bit. And the only way that I can say that is if when we go back to what we talked about earlier, if I take an athlete that has an identity and only knows themselves as an athlete, and I said, okay, we need to step out of that box right now, that confidence level goes from the 35th floor to the ground level because all of a sudden the fear, the anxiety kind of sets in. And then I think that muddies the emotional intelligence at that point, if that makes sense to you. So I think it's having to take that and build that and figure out that identity, build that confidence level back up. And then the emotional intelligence starts creeping back in there on
Yeah.
it. They've had it, but they've had it in sport. But now, trying to figure out who I am next and getting that confidence level out and then getting that emotional intelligence to kind of creep back in on that new identity kind of goes hand in hand there.
Yeah. And I think in the United States, we teach young boys to obviously not to show emotion and to be tough. And so I think a lot of times, through sport, we get this, they put this false bravado out there that I'm competitive, I'm hard, I'm tough, but inside they're feeling something completely different. And, I don't think emotional intelligence is talked about enough with athletes because it doesn't matter what you put out there on the outside. It's how you're reacting to adversity on the inside. And a lot of the higher level athletes that I've seen, they're able to do that because they do have identities outside of sports and like the good family support like you've talked about. And so I think there's a lot to that. I think there's a lot to that that's not spoken about enough.
I 100% agree with you. I think a lot of that gets kind of crammed down there, and just and sits there, while the athlete has to perform and try to get away from those type of emotions that would affect their performance in a negative way on that. I had just actually put up a post recently, and I only wrote it because somebody had asked me, is it easier to do with male athletes or female athletes? And I said, "Well, that's a tough it's a little tough question to answer. I mean, I can answer in a macro way that females are easier for a lot of reasons, but it's really athlete dependent. Females it's easier because they're more vulnerable in that way. They've dealt with the emotional issues. They've gone through some identity issues as teen girls or you know, young women do more than guys do. So, yeah, there's certainly a difference there.
Well, let's kind of talk about your equations that you have through your business that you talk about. Explain those and how they work together.
Yeah, the XQ that I have under athlete XQ wasn't just a thrown up there because I like the two letters. It's the combination of IQ of actual intelligence plus the emotional, the EQ of emotional intelligence equals the XQ there. So I think you had talked about earlier in our discussion about you don't know what you don't know, and then about blind spots because it's certainly easier for somebody else to see your blind spots as sometimes we don't see the forest through the trees, and the waters are a little muddied there. It's about taking what you know, adding a bit of what you don't know, and then taking I always thought that I could sit there, that I'm a very curious and observant person, that I could sit there and watch an athlete warm up, independent of any sport, and almost know how they're going to perform that day. Just by facial cues, body cues, how they're warming up, if they look stressed, if they look relaxed, if they looked angry, whatever, I could always tell. And it's the same thing with getting an athlete on the emotional IQ side of things, the EQ side of things, and getting really them to understand how their emotional well-being affects their transition.
So when you speak about IQ, you're talking not IQ in their sport, you're talking IQ.
Yeah, we're talking about life. We're
Okay.
talking about life at this point, right? They've had coaches, trainers, colleges, and all that stuff to do with their sports stuff. That's there. That's the left side. I'm dealing with the right side. So what do we do? What do we do outside of sport? Type thing. I've dealt with, people with that are hot-headed. I've dealt with people that probably bordered on the narcissistic side of the high, self-confidence thing. And I've dealt with, people that had a high level of self-esteem in sport that came out of sport that looked like they were walking around with their head in the clouds,
Yeah.
the black cloud type thing. So it's really kind of getting them to understand. And again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't pride myself in being a psychologist, but it's really trying to get them, because I mean, you do performance work. So I'm sure there's some mindset work in there
Mhm.
that you're doing, and visualization and other things. It's really the same thing outside of sport that I'm doing with them, to get them to understand why they're feeling a certain way, and to get that self-esteem back up with their identity outside of sport, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Is there any rhyme or reason in the relationship between IQ and EQ, or is that just completely random to each individual?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, I think it's unique to each individual, but there is a correlation, between the two. Generally, people that are a little bit higher, and again, this is information that's readily available on the internet here. Generally, people that are a little higher on the IQ front tend to be higher on the EQ front as well. And I think it's also culture based and, trauma based as well, because some athletes I've dealt with have not come from the best home situations, either, and well, I shouldn't say have dealt with. I mean, they experienced, some trauma things that probably led to some PTSD, that they're not only bringing with them the sport, they're bringing with them outside of sport. And again, I will get to this, I'm sure, but I'm pretty much, a truth teller, and anybody that I feel is having, significant mental health issues, I certainly refer to mental health professionals to deal with on that.
Sure. So when you hear the phrase, he's wired that way, he's just wired that way. What does that mean to you from an athletic perspective?
Well, part of it is, are they intrinsically wired that way? Were they born that way? Are they innately that way? Or were they coached that way? Were they coached to be, did somebody that got into, and this may be the right or wrong analogy, but was somebody that got into special forces in the military, are they uniquely wired to be a special forces soldier? And I think they are. Right. And I think they also have to be trained to take it to the next level. And so I think when you talk about somebody being wired in a good or a bad way, I think, yes, part of it's innate and part of it's they've either been coached that way or taught that to be that way as well.
I think it's interesting you bring up Navy SEALs because I think the only commonality they've found in Navy SEALs is trauma
Hmm.
at some point in their life. And, that could lead us into another conversation about how do you coach individuals through those traumatic situations? And, I'm of the opinion that the losses teach us much, much more than the wins. How do you address that with your clients?
Yeah, so I'm a believer as you are. I think failure's probably taught me more than success has. And especially, I always tell people, I said the common denominator of all your problems is you, right? So if you take that self-reflection and say, how did I contribute to that situation? There's a lot of growth from that. Again, I want to restate, if I feel that an athlete that I'm working with actually has some higher level of mental, and I don't want to call it a disorder, but some mental type of issue that's going on, I certainly encourage them to seek professional help on that. But a lot of the trauma, and I come from a family, I've come from an abusive household myself, so I've dealt with my own PTSD issues. So I can actually relate to them on that aspect of it. And again, I think in combination with the mental health professional and working with me, it's kind of getting them to understand that, that it isn't, it's what happened to you, not that you have to be diagnosed and walk around with this trauma and that be your story your whole life.
Switching gears a little bit, one thing I use a lot, and I've been in coaching roles, and I talk a lot about process based training. So, let's focus on the things we can control on a day to day
Hmm.
basis. Not our goal is to win a state championship or a national title. That's a result. And I think too many programs in our country are too outcome focused where we skip steps along the way, and I think those steps are hugely important for development. Have you seen a change over the years in your clients to where they're just focused on the outcome? So the athletic career's over. Now I'm going to go get the executive level job with a big company, big corporation, or I'm going to own my own business or whatever it is, and not really focused on the process of getting there.
It's always outcome focused. Always. I've not dealt with anybody that has talked about the process and enjoying the process. And they talk about, the entrepreneur's journey, right? It shouldn't be outcome driven, right? You should enjoy the process along the way. There's milestones along the way that you can't forget about, right? It's not finish line focused. I think you bring up a hugely important point here, is because that is one of the things when I talk to my athletes that we spend a lot of time talking about. It isn't outcome focused because I think again there's this misnomer out there that your athletic prowess, your athletic competency, your athletic abilities, your athletic identity is going to just lead you to the next big thing in life, right? There's this lie that's just perpetuated upon athletes that, oh my God, you have this tremendous skill set. And you do. I'm not saying you don't have this tremendous skill set, but it's like I tell my athletes, I said, especially those that had 4 years or had, significant amount of university, education, is that think about what you've done. You've climbed to the top of the money scale already at 22, 23, 25, 30 years old. You've already ascended to the top. That everything that goes up has to come down, right? And so you're not making 3 million a year now. You're not making 9 million a year now. You're not getting paid $25,000 for a gold medal now. So you're going down while all of your friends that weren't athletes in college are still ascending up. So we don't want you to ascend from the top all the way back to the bottom and have to start over again. So getting back to your point about whether I prefer to work with them beforehand or after, it's definitely beforehand because we want to stop the fall. We don't want to have to start completely over again. So how to, not fall from the top all the way to the bottom? How do we kind of stop it somewhere in between and get you back on that ascending to the top in your next role in life?
Yeah. Has NIL
But
made
you're right, it's outcome driven. It's always outcome driven. It's like, if I made 9,000,000, why can't I go out and make 9,000,000 in the real world?
yeah.
Like, well, how many people do you know that make $9,000,000 in the real world? And I said, and what experience and accountability and all this stuff do you have
Yeah.
those people get paid for? So yeah.
Do you has NIL made this even more difficult when some of these pro athletes have been seeing the money now for
It's made it hugely difficult because it's filled these college athletes' pockets full of cash, and this is gonna sound bad, but it's money that they probably would have never seen. I mean, especially these athletes that are getting paid. I mean, in the town that I live in has a university, it has a Division I basketball program. It's a mid-major D1 program. I don't know how many guys. There's 15, 17 guys on the team. The top 10 guys in their team in a mid-major, $350,000 this year each. There may be one of those guys that is a transfer portal guy in that probably has the potential ability to make the NBA. Potential ability. The rest of these guys are done after college. Maybe somebody goes to Europe and makes 60 or $80,000 a year. None of these guys are going to make $350,000 a year. Again, probably playing sport. And I don't know any 23-year-old that steps into a job or 22-year-old steps into a job makes $350,000 a year right away either. But they're now getting this sense that this is the norm, right? And $350,000, and I've had these discussions with them, and especially some of them that now get recruited, have a good year, or getting recruited by other Power 5 schools and things like that are being offered even more money. And it's like, okay, but is that, it's not generational. Maybe you mentioned the University of Oregon, but I think their quarterback's coming back this year and getting paid $9 million. Okay. Now you're starting to talk more generational money type thing. But a lot of these guys that are in the 300, 150,000, 350,000, all right, yeah, that buys you a good life when you're 20 years old in a nice apartment outside of campus and things like that. But how much is being saved? And it's not, money that you're going to take with you. I don't have to work till I'm 30 or 35 type thing. And it's like, this is a great start. So let's talk about this as a great start and what that looks like down the road.
yeah.
But yes, it's certainly affected the mindset of the collegiate athlete these days.
Yeah.
Everybody that I've talked to, even high school athletes that I've talked to that are going to D1 level, are all looking for the paycheck now.
Well, and from your perspective of emotional intelligence, I don't think handing a 20-year-old 350 grand a year is gonna do a whole lot for developing
Your
emotional
fontanelle's already been
intelligence.
fused yet.
Yeah,
So yeah. No, it doesn't help them at all, and again, I don't know how much financial counseling goes into it. I mean, I know, there's some booster involvement in it to try and get these athletes to kind of protect the money that they're given, but, some booster programs are doing the right thing and some booster programs just wanna win.
right, right. And I have a great relationship with my former teammates in college, and the reason I have a great relationship with them is because that's when we did back in the day when we didn't get paid.
Right.
We got to know our teammates and we fought for each other and we trained with each other and we talk about it. You know, what would life have been back then if we would have been getting paid? You know, it would be completely different. And, you know, our biggest thing is, you know, we were on a top five NCAA team. We wanted rings. We wanted conference
Right.
championship rings. We wanted a national title. That's what was our focus. And now I talk to athletes, you know, athletes that I train and, you know, they're pissed off because so and so on their team who they're averaging more points than is getting paid more than them. And that's where their mind is.
Yeah, so I went on a recruiting visit a couple of years ago, to a certain university, which I won't name, and I was there with about 15 other parents. And one of the parents asked a question about how many of your athletes actually attend school in person on campus. And I saw the recruiting coordinator turn to one of the position coaches and like look like, how do I answer this? So the answer was none of them. And what I find is that is now a commonality, is that most athletes are taking online classes now and are not either in the athletic building on campus doing it, or they're in their apartment doing it. They're not even on campus interacting with the other student body anymore. And I don't know, because of the riches of the NIL, how many are even completing degrees anymore. So
Right.
if if you're making $350,000 and you end up leaving school, you didn't even leave with a college degree. So what door's that gonna open for you?
And in their heads, that 350,000 is always gonna be there.
Yeah, if they didn't buy a $350,000 car with it, yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you made the comment, and I think you use this on your website, you talk about blind spots. Explain that and how do you identify those?
I I think it I think you identify it through a series of conversations. One of the things that I work with athletes about, and I think it's important not only as an athlete, but I teach my own kids this, is about learning how to ask the right questions. And that kind of came about early on for me in working with athletes, especially ones that were getting, paid in the millions of dollars. And I asked them, I said, okay, I trust that your financial advisor, your wealth manager is doing a good job for you, you know. But I said, it's still your money, right? And I said, so what questions would you ask your financial person? So because it's your nest egg, right? You're either gonna use it to start your family and buy a house and start a business or whatever after your career. This is your nest egg right now. And you have this advantage that most people at this age don't have. So what questions would you be asking your financial advisor to make sure you're on the right track to where you want to get to when your playing career is? And nobody can answer that question. And then the second question I asked, I said, okay, so you get statements, right, from your financial advisor. And I said, do you look at them? 100% no. So part of that goes back into the blind spot. So I said, well, how do you know you're not getting screwed? Well, I just trust them. Okay. So it goes kind of into, part of asking the right questions. And I said, I'm not trying to train you to be a CPA, a financial advisor, or to have an above average IQ in terms of financial history. But these are the things. I don't care if you're an athlete or you're a dad working, at some job that puts money, away into a 401k. You still have to know, what's happening here. You still have to know how it works, the questions to ask, and things like that. And you have to know, like I think what you had said earlier, um, in terms of you don't know what you don't know and what can trip you up, right? And so these are the blind spots that you're not seeing. And I don't really have specifics to say because it's really individualized and specifics that way. But it's kind of like I see this, but you don't see that. And why are you not seeing that?
You've talked you've made the comment several times about how athletes, just assume things are gonna work out okay, after their athletic career is done. We know that's garbage. We know that's
Mhm.
not what they're really feeling on the inside. So what do you think it is that scares athletes the most about life after sports?
I think what scares them the most in my experience is not knowing what's next. I think they have most of them have this kind of fantasy of what's next. I think what we talked about earlier is that, what they've done in their athletic career is just going to easily transition into the next thing in their life. And like we said, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't happen. I think they've also been sold a bill of goods out there, by the professional leagues, by certain agents, by certain financial people, by their own posses that they hang with that you get enough money, everything's gonna be okay type thing. So I think what scares them most is about what's next, because and they don't want to talk about it. I mean, and I appreciate you having me on because this isn't a sexy cool conversation, right? Because if I were sexy cool and I was promoting the thing that everybody wanted, then I probably wouldn't have time to have this conversation with you. But we're having the conversation that nobody wants to have, right? I'm like this insurance policy in a way, right? It's like, do I have to really pay that much car insurance? Well, I guess I have to. Okay, type thing. It's not fun. I don't really want to do it, so I'm that guy.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know how, and I can't make it. I can't, like they say, you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? I can't make it look any better. The only thing that I can do is be completely truthful and transparent and give you a dose of realism, which most people don't like. I mean, I do a pretty good job now of onboarding people, and I certainly don't take on everybody that's referred to me just because I just don't think it's either a good fit or people are fishing around, because it's like, if I'm going to invest in you, you need to invest in me as well. Right. And there has to be kind of that mutual synergy. So we both get something out of it, right? In the end. So, I'm the guy that holds the mirror to your face.
Yeah.
And that is not something that a lot of people want to have happen to them.
Yeah.
But it's necessary. I mean, if they truly sit there and say, "Yes, Kim, I want to be as successful outside of sport, whether that's a husband, a wife, in business, an entrepreneur, whatever, rap singer, I don't care, whatever, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to do that and make that happen, then you and I are a great match." But the day that put the mirror in your face and you either call me out or don't call me back, then yeah, that's happened
Yeah.
before. So
Yeah. Well, it might not be exciting, might not be sexy, but I think it's very important work that you're doing.
thank you.
What over the years working with these elite level athletes, what's kind of the most important thing you've learned that you use in your own life?
Let's see what I've learned in my compassion, patience. I'm certainly not the most patient person, and I've had to learn that by working with others. Because I would sit there and talk to them about, well, they would complain that somebody else got, and again, the the analogy of the finish line, somebody got there ahead of me type thing in life, not in sport, but in life. And I would sit there and say, well, it doesn't matter who got there first as long as you finally get there type thing. And then I'd have to check myself and say, do I actually do that? So I think, a lot of conversations that I have with athletes, and let having them explain the situation and me offer feedback. I'm more in my process. It's not like I feel like I'm giving advice. I asked them questions in terms of what we're working on. So really the solution or the answer to their issue comes from them. It doesn't come from me.
Yeah.
I think. So I sit there, I think the thing that I've learned from working with the athletes is that I have to check myself as well, because if I'm offering this level of advice or answering this question, I have to sit there and think, God, am I doing that myself?
Yeah.
In
Practice
my
what you
in my
preach.
in practice what you preach, and I certainly don't wanna be a hypocrite in that area. So I've learned that, and the other thing I learned, and this came from my consulting role, is that I really have to understand my audience, and I have to understand them really well, and it goes back to, the player associations and so on and so forth offering these cookie cutter methodologies which don't work, is I really have to understand the person I'm working with, because in consulting, I would come into a company, and it's easy for me as the outsider to see the forest through the trees and come up with solutions for them. And then, we put these solutions in place. And then what I failed to realize was the human capital there going to be able to execute on the solutions that I put forth. And then when I had a couple of failures in that and realized, well, why did that not work? Because that should have worked. And I realized that I didn't understand my audience well enough, and that like we said, one size doesn't fit all, and that I have to really understand. And I'm a big person, and maybe this is contrary to what you do, but I don't sit there and take somebody's weaknesses and say, let's make your weaknesses better. I'm a big proponent of accentuating what you're already good at, and let's fit that into what you're already good at, because I can't tell you to go out and be a public speaker when that's like taking your nails and running them down a chalkboard, and it's going to take a bulldozer to pull you into doing that. That doesn't work for either one of us. So let's accentuate what you're good at and build upon that.
Yeah. So do you actually move these people towards job placement? Do you communicate
Yeah,
with the hiring companies?
yeah, I mean, I can't. I certainly can, and I've done that. I've been able to get people internships with some of my network, or just networking through there. So it's certainly, that's part of it. Is if you don't have a network out of sport, let's start building your network. And some of it is, if I really like this person and I believe. I shouldn't say if I really like this person or believe in this person. I actually, all my clients I do, but if I feel it's a good fit, I start help introducing them and help build their network. And I've certainly got help get people jobs, but I also don't want them to use me as a crutch. Or I certainly don't want to sit there and say, well, you need me for the next 5 years or whatever. The quicker you can cut the umbilical cord, or we feel you can cut the umbilical cord, let's cut it and get on your own and be successful and do that. But certainly the building of the network and assisting them in doing that is certainly part of the process.
Okay. All right. So the way I wrap up every show, we get to do a speed round.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you 6 questions. I want short answers, and I don't want you to think about them very long. Okay. All right. Here we go. Winning or losing, where do we learn more?
Losing.
One question every athlete should ask themselves, but rarely does.
Am I doing this because I love it?
Habit that quietly separates high performers from everyone else.
Consistency.
Best advice for an athlete who feels stuck but can't explain why.
To do some self-actualization work.
Is overthinking an enemy or an ally?
Oh boy. The tough one. Most of the time it's an enemy.
Is growth ever comfortable?
It shouldn't ever be comfortable, or you're not growing.
Yeah, perfect. Well, Kim, thank you very much. Anybody listening wants to get a hold of you, where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, yeah. So most of my stuff I put on LinkedIn under my name, Kim Fauskee, or my email address is me@kimfauskee.com. And anybody is happy to reach out. I'm happy to always chat with anybody that's looking for a little help in navigation or a little advice or whatever they need.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've learned a lot from you. My company's trained over 400 NCAA athletes, so I'm definitely going to keep you in mind for those situations.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate you having me on. Like you said, I know it's a little outside of what you normally talk about, but I appreciate you bringing kind of attention to this issue.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I really want to thank you for your time. And I think there's a lot of other things we could have talked about, so we
I'm
might,
happy to come back and chat anytime you want.
yeah, we might have to do that. So
Okay.
thank you again, and really appreciate it.
You're welcome.